Well, g'day. Okay, I'm just going to rearrange things a little bit up here. This is my family. Next to Jesus, the most important people in my life. My wife Samantha, we've just celebrated 20 years together. 20 years married. It's a real joy to be married to her. She's a lot of fun. She taught me to play. And we complement one another in so many different ways. That's a nice way of saying that on every single personality test that we have ever done, we are diametrically opposed. So it's been fun being married to her and learning from her. We have 5 kids, as you can see. Cassie, our oldest, is 14. Peter, our youngest, with Samantha over there, is 4. So it's a fun time in our household. You really know you're alive. Okay, now let me see if I've got this working okay. Yes, I do. Excellent. Have a look at these photos up here. What I want you to think about today is who lives and works around you that is very unlike you. Who is very different from you? Perhaps as you look at that, being here at Pomona and getting a tertiary education, maybe it's the mechanic that you put your car into to get fixed. Is he someone that you kind of find difficult to connect with, have a conversation with? Is it people from a very different religious background? Is it the CEO guy? Is it kids? Are there people in your world that are very unlike you, that there's actually a kind of cultural barrier to cross? You know, those cultural barriers have always existed, and they've always been hard to cross. Have you ever been in a situation where you are with such a person and you kind of feel kind of nervous? What do you say? How do you connect with them? How do you have a conversation? Maybe you might even be afraid of this person if they're in authority over you, or just afraid that they might misunderstand you. Today, I want to have a look at what does Jesus think about these sort of cultural barriers. I visited Israel 2 years ago, and one of my surprises as I journeyed around Israel, and particularly the Sea of Galilee, is finding out just how incredibly multicultural Israel was in the time of Jesus. Now, I kind of had this picture of Israel. Well, you know, it's occupied territory. The Romans are there, but you've got the Romans and you've got the Jews, right? That's Israel. Well, actually, it's a bit more complex than that. Here's a map of Israel. You can see down here there's Jerusalem, the Dead Sea. Up top is the Sea of Galilee. And you might have heard of some of these biblical towns of Capernaum, Chorazin, Bethsaida, where Jesus spent a lot of his ministry years and travelled around talking to people, doing miracles, teaching. This is a bit more of a close-up around the Sea of Galilee. Okay, here's where we get a little different, perhaps. I want everybody to stand up. And then move out from the middle there, so you're standing around the outside of the seats. You'll be coming back in a couple of minutes, so you can leave all your gear there, but just go and stand around the outside. Okay, some people can come up the front here, as long as you don't get in the way of the projector, it's fine, but kind of come around here. Some people out the back near the sound desk. This is great, man. Sense of power up here is awesome. Okay. You know, you guys are kind of like the land around the Sea of Galilee. The chairs in the middle, that's water. Okay? So if anybody would stay there, they'd be getting wet. You guys are safely on the land around the place. So I want us to kind of imagine that our little map in this room is like this map up here. So the Jordan River comes from the north, kind of about where I am up here, into the Sea of Galilee, and it exits out the south, kind of around where the sound desk is. Okay? And that's the Jordan River. By the way, river, it's more of a creek, actually. It's actually quite small. So there are different, in the Roman times when Jesus was around, there were different territories that bordered onto the Sea of Galilee, different Roman dominions. And you can see some of them labelled here. I want to point out a few and just describe what's going on around the Sea of Galilee, which, by the way, the lake itself is only about, I've got this in kilometres, I should have translated into miles. It's about 26 kilometres long and 15 wide. What it basically means is that if you're in a boat in the Sea of Galilee in the middle there, you can see the shoreline the whole way round. Okay, it's also not that big. If you're a decent swimmer, you could swim from one side to the other. So, Sea of Galilee. Some of the areas around here. Who's heard of the Decapolis down this area here? You heard of the Decapolis? It's mentioned in the Gospels. Decapolis is a Greek word. It simply means 10 cities. Okay, the Decapolis was actually a bunch of cities. You can see some of them named here, Hippus and Gadara and Scythopolis. Scythopolis, by the way, is really interesting to visit because it's really well preserved from Roman times. But this area here was 10 cities who were independent city-states that were granted independent rule by the Romans as they took over this whole area some 90 years before Jesus was on the scene. So they're fairly independent of Roman rule. Okay, there's no one Roman ruler over them. And they're a very kind of Greek Gentile culture around Decapolis. They're very proud of their independence and fairly pagan in their religion. Up north here, this is a place called Trachonitis, or a territory. It's bigger than that. It's ruled by a guy called Herod Philip. Now, if you've read in the Gospels about Herod Antipas, Herod who was there in the time of Jesus, well, he actually ruled Galilee, and we'll come to him in a moment, but his brother Herod Philip ruled this area called Trachonitis, and he was a fairly mild ruler. Okay, so he kind of tried to keep the peace a fair bit. He was fairly amicable towards different religions, different races, and so what you tended to find was people who would get in trouble with Herod Antipas, his brother over here, would come over to Philip's territory and set up base there because he was more accommodating. Gamla, that you see there, was a real centre for zealots. Who knows what a zealot is? Yeah? Some of you? I see some hands. I see some nods anyway. Zealots are they're Jews, fiercely religious Jews who hated Roman rule. Okay, they're the sort of people that would come up behind a Roman soldier and stab him in the back. Okay, zealot as in zealous for their religion and Israeli independence. Okay, so Gamla became a real hive of zealots in Jesus' time. Okay, Galilee over here. This, of course, is where Jesus was born, in Nazareth, where he grew up. Born in Bethlehem, which is way south. Let me say that again. He grew up in Nazareth, okay? But he spent most of his ministry time up here in the north of the Sea of Galilee. But that whole area is ruled by Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas is a really nasty guy. He's the one who beheaded John the Baptist. You got on Herod's bad side, you were dead. One of the Roman Caesars actually said of Herod Antipas, it was better to be a pig in Herod's household. Okay, he's a Jew. This is not nice language. Better to be a pig in Herod's household than a member of his family. Okay, because he actually murdered several members of his family. Not a nice guy. Okay, on the north here, this little triangle of towns, Chorazin, Capernaum, Bethsaida. You would have heard of those towns in the Gospels. This is a real triangle of Orthodox Judaism. The towns here are largely ruled by Pharisees and the synagogues in those towns. The population is almost exclusively Jewish and Orthodox Jewish. These people actually did not like Gentiles, tried to avoid Gentiles, even though they're surrounded by them, and kind of Judaism. Strict Judaism is the rule of these towns. The rest of Galilee is fairly Roman. So Tiberias is a great capital city of Galilee, and it's very Roman in nature, very Gentile. So you can see, going around here, so by the way, let's see, Tiberias. Who's in the area of Tiberias? Down here. Okay, so very Roman over there. Where are our zealots? Somewhere over here in Gamla? Yeah, who's a zealot? Awesome. Okay. And Decapolis, down that area, sort of you guys are fairly Gentile and Greek and fiercely independent. Okay, great. Awesome. So as you can see, the area around the Sea of Galilee is very multicultural, very multi-ethnic, multi-religious. Okay, it's not just the Jews and the overlords of Rome. It's actually very, very mixed. Okay, have a seat now. Why is that important? Why have we just spent 5 minutes delving into that? Apart from the fun of seeing you guys get up and get back into your seats again. You know, as we read the Gospels, it is really important to know and understand where Jesus is, because where he is determines who he is speaking to. If you don't know who Jesus is speaking to, you actually miss so much of what is going on as you read what he said. And we're going to look at a couple of examples of that. We'll start with two very similar miracles in the Gospels, and we're going to look at the Mark versions. The feeding of 5,000 and the feeding of 4,000 a few months later. Jesus miraculously fed 5,000 people. That's recorded in Mark 6. But where was he? Who did he feed? Who was in this crowd? Who does he speak to? And is there any difference in the feeding of the 4,000? Was it the same people? Was it different people? And what do the answers to those questions mean for what he said and what he did? Well, I'm going to get you guys to do some legwork and figure that out. Can you grab out a Bible? Digital, paper, whatever you've got there, grab out a Bible. And we're going to read the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000 in Mark chapters 6 and 8. Okay, what I'm going to do here, we've got a neat aisle down the middle here. So, over this side, can you read, just read to yourselves, Mark chapter 6. Got a bit of a problem here, is it me? Am I still on? Yeah? Okay. Mark chapter 6 over on this side. You'll find the feeding of the 5,000 in that chapter, so just read that chunk of scripture all the way through. But as you read it, ask yourself, where is Jesus and who is he speaking to? Okay, this feeding issue that comes up, who initiates that problem? How long has Jesus been in this area? Those sort of questions. Just observe that through the passage. You guys on this half, can you read Mark 8, the feeding of the 4,000? Okay, same questions. Where is Jesus? Who's he speaking to? How long's he been there? Okay, so I'll just give you a couple of minutes. Just read those passages. Can everybody see a Bible? Yep, great. Okay, now let me let you in on a secret. Jesus' location, his actual location there, you might need to look outside of the passage itself to find it. Okay, the Mark 6 people over here, you might want to have a look at the Luke 9 version of the same account, and you'll find out where he is. Luke 9 verse 10. And the Mark 8 people, you might just want to go to the very end of the previous chapter, chapter 7. Just check, where is Jesus? Hang on, I'll ask that for real in a second. Okay, so most people had a chance to read through that passage. Okay, Mark chapter 6, if you flick over to Luke 9, where is Jesus? Sorry? Bethsaida? Very good. Excellent. So Jesus is in Bethsaida. Remember our map? It's right on the north end of the Sea of Galilee. It's within that Orthodox Jewish triangle of towns of Capernaum, Chorazin, Bethsaida. Okay? So he's up there. Okay. Mark chapter 8, where is he? The Decapolis. Interesting. Okay, so he's in two different places here. Now look, there is a lot that we can take out of this feeding of the 5,000 or the 4,000. Okay? There is a lot that I could speak about here. There's a connection back to God providing for his people through Moses in the wilderness, the manna that comes from the sky. Elijah, the prophet in the Old Testament, actually fed 100 guys in a very similar fashion. Okay, he took bread and he broke it and he distributed it, and wow, it fed everybody, sort of thing. Okay, so for the Jews who were experiencing this miracle, okay, there's all these connections back to the Old Testament. And we could talk about God's power to provide for us. And we could talk about, in fact, God is so powerful and provides so well for us. There's an overabundance of his supply demonstrated by the extra baskets of food left over and all that sort of stuff, okay? And that's all truth coming out of these scriptures. But actually today, I want to focus on what we learn about these two miracles and from where they're located. And I want to particularly focus in on what is Jesus trying to teach his disciples. Okay. So, Bethsaida, Decapolis, two different locations. So, is that the right order? Not yet. So, who is he speaking to in Bethsaida? You guys? Who's he speaking to? Sorry? Hometown people. Okay. He actually has a base of operations, a house in Capernaum. Bethsaida is pretty close, and it's still within that Orthodox Jewish triangle I was talking about on the north of the Sea of Galilee. Okay, so he's talking to Jews. He's talking to a lot of people who knew him as a Jew. Okay, in fact, if you go backwards from Mark 6 and Mark chapter 5, Jesus has just sent out his disciples in that area of Chorazin and Bethsaida and Capernaum to do ministry, and they're doing miracles all through that part of territory amongst Jews. Okay, so they're seeing healings, they're teaching, all this sort of stuff, and they're talking about Jesus as they go. So this crowd is probably a gathering of those that have seen the miracles the disciples have done and come to see the master that they are speaking about. And they would be predominantly a Jewish crowd. Okay? Decapolis, Mark chapter 8. Who's in the crowd? Greeks? Exactly. Gentiles. Okay? Non-Jews. What difference does that make? By the way, it also explains why Mark thought it interesting to note how many basketfuls were left over. Do you know in Mark 6 when he says that 12 basketfuls of food were left over and collected? Okay, what's 12 is in Jewish numerology is the number of, the tribes of Israel. It's the number of Israel. Okay, and he's speaking to Jews. Make sense? How many basketfuls in the Decapolis? 7. Jewish numerology again. 7 is the number of the Gentiles. Okay, when Joshua brings Israel into the promised land and conquers it, he kicks out 7 Gentile tribes. And ever since that time, in Jewish numerology, 7 is the number of the Gentiles. And interesting that Mark notes, okay, 12, 7, different audience. So the crowds are very different. And I want to pick up on how the disciples respond to these different crowds. Okay. Mark chapter 6. Mark 6. Who initiates this issue of feeding the crowd? As you read through the disciples, exactly. Okay? Hey, Jesus, you've been teaching all day. This crowd is away from town. They're hungry. How are we going to feed them? There's an issue here. Okay? Mark 8, who initiates? Jesus. Okay. I was also going to ask, after how long do the disciples initiate? Sorry? You can see that he's been teaching, it says late in the day. Okay, so it's most of that day that Jesus has been teaching this Jewish crowd near Bethsaida. And the disciples say there's a problem here. Okay, back to Mark 8. It's Jesus who initiates. After how long? 3 days. 3 days. This crowd has been listening to Jesus teaching. Where are the disciples saying, hey, why don't we feed this crowd? Why didn't they initiate? Why is it that it's after 3 days that Jesus says there's a problem here? These people are hungry. And no wonder after 3 days. What's going on? Well, you kind of get this feeling that the disciples, they cared about the crowd of the 5,000. Why? They're Jews. So are the disciples. In the time of Jesus, the Jews, the people of God, had become rather snobbish in their own selection by God as the people of God. We're it. Okay? And they forgot the reason why we're it. God chose the nation of Israel to demonstrate his character to the rest of the world. When God chooses Abraham, he says, I will make you a light to the nations. The Jewish people in the time of Jesus had forgotten that. They'd actually isolated themselves from the rest of the world as much as was possible. And with the Jewish occupation, they had come to hate, sometimes, often, the Gentiles. They'd forgotten their purpose in being the people of God. That kind of sounds familiar to me with some of the churches that I've been a part of. Sad to say. So when Jesus comes to Jewish Bethsaida and he performs this great miracle of feeding the crowd, 5,000 men and a whole bunch of women and children beside that, probably over 10,000 people there, he feeds them all. This Jewish crowd would have gone, aha, this guy is a prophet like Moses, like Elijah. God has come to reach his people again, to provide for us, to connect with us, because we are his chosen people. Okay, this makes sense. But then, a few months later, Jesus crosses the Sea of Galilee and he goes to the Decapolis, to Gentile people. And he does exactly the same miracle. He feeds them. The disciples did not see a problem with Gentiles going hungry, did not initiate feeding them, did not even think about a miracle to provide for them, because it was so outside their cultural boundaries, their box of thinking of what God does. And in fact, the disciples standing around Jesus watching him do this miracle in feeding the 4,000 in Gentile territory would have been shocked, scandalized. Because this is Jesus, the prophet, come from God and giving the blessings that naturally flow to the people of God and giving them to the Gentiles. That was radical. That was shocking. And I find it fascinating, not only that the disciples did not initiate and Jesus had to make it happen, but you know what Jesus does with those disciples in the midst of this miracle? Did you see it? He blesses the food and he gives it to the people? No, he gives it to the disciples and says, go and distribute this. And they do, and in going, there is the miracle as God provides food enough for the 4,000 Gentiles. You know what I see happening there? It is forbidden in Orthodox Jewish circles to break bread and to eat with Gentiles. But here is Jesus, the prophet of God, saying, you, Jewish disciple, you take this food and you go and feed that family of Gentiles sitting on the grass. You eat with them. You give them food. Man, he is just breaking through all these cultural barriers and overcoming their cultural religious snobbishness. Jesus has to wake up the disciples to the fact that God's blessings of food, but also the gospel, are for the whole world, not just the Jewish people. And we would completely miss what's going on there if we were not watching for where he is and therefore who Jesus is speaking to. And actually, as we read through the Gospels, we see it happening time and time again. Jesus takes his disciples after a fierce time of ministry and of miracles and all that sort of stuff. He goes on a kind of a leadership retreat. To where? Tyre and Sidon, Gentile territory. When the average Jew travelled from the Sea of Galilee, that religious Orthodox area of Capernaum, when they went for a pilgrimage down to Jerusalem, they went all the way across to the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee and down through that territory because there were Jewish towns on the way, and then came back across the Jordan River to get to Jerusalem, to the temple. Much shorter to actually go along the same side of the Jordan River. But you know where that path goes through? Samaria. Okay, half-breeds. Not Gentile, not Jew, but both. Ugh. But what does Jesus do? John chapter 4. He walks through Samaria, meets the woman at the well, rubs the disciples' noses in the fact that they have no idea what God's mission is, what his food to do the will of God is all about. Challenges them to connect with this lady who is so open to God and what God is doing that she talks to her whole village. They spend a couple of days there and most of the village comes to know Jesus. Jesus takes his disciples near the end of his ministry on a leadership retreat up to Caesarea Philippi. Man, I could go into some great depth about Caesarea Philippi and what a centre of paganism it was in the time of Jesus. No good Jewish boy would ever go near Caesarea Philippi, yet Jesus takes his disciples there. And it's there that Peter makes his great declaration of, you are the Christ. Real turning point in the Gospels. Jesus then, from then on, just sets his face towards the cross in Jerusalem, walks down there. No more ministry around. The disciples have got it. I'm heading for Jerusalem. Key point of time in Jesus' ministry. But where does it happen? Caesarea Philippi. Pagan territory. Jesus is doing this all the time. You know why? So that when we get to the end of Matthew's Gospel and Jesus gives the Great Commission before he goes back to heaven, he says, go and make disciples of all nations. That is not the first time the disciples have heard that, seen that, experienced that, been involved in it. Jesus has been doing that all through his ministry, going to all nations. So he can now leave with that instruction, and the disciples know what it means, know what to do to make it happen. Cultural barriers are tough. We still got them. They're all around us. But Jesus expects us to cross them, to take the gospel to those who need to hear of the love of Jesus, his death on the cross for every person on this planet. One of the reasons I've been asked to come and speak today is to talk about what God is up to in Australia. One of the things that I love about the Australian ministry is the fact that we've got cultural boundaries everywhere that we need to get across. Did you know that on average, over 25% of the university students in Australia are international students on every campus, mostly from Asia and the Middle East? That means a huge percentage of the students that you would come across if you walked onto an Australian campus is from some of the most closed countries in the world to the traditional model of sending missionaries to build churches. But those same countries are choosing their best and brightest young people and they're sending them to the West, places like Australia, to get a tertiary education. When they go back home, they'll go into positions of great influence because they've got that Western degree. But while they're in places like Australia, they are wide open to the gospel and actually much easier to reach on a campus in Australia than they are in their own hometowns, where there's secret police and restrictions and they're fearing the reaction of parents. When they're in Australia, they're wide open, they're interested, they're free. Our vision in Australia is to see them not only won to Christ, crossing those cultural barriers and giving them the gospel, but actually to train and disciple them so that they can go back to their own home countries as missionaries to their own people. What better missionaries are there? It's part of our vision in Australia. I could go on about what God's up to in Australia for a long time, but just briefly, 10 years ago, we were on 4 university campuses with Cru in Australia. Today, we're on 33. We have a vision in 2020 to be on every major campus in Australia. That's 88 campuses. The Pacific Southwest region of Cru has been partnering with Australia for quite a few of those all of those last 10 years. And God has been working through people like you coming on summer projects and stint to create movements, true spiritual movements of multiplying students on the campuses in Australia. He's building his kingdom down under. And I would like to take the opportunity here to invite you to be a part of that adventure, to come to Australia and be part of building the kingdom down under in order to reach the world. And I'm going to be around here for after kind of this hour. For the next hour, we're going to have a meeting downstairs in the food court. For those who are interested, just to ask questions, find out more information about what God is up to in Australia and what it might look like for you to join in what God is doing there. But whether you decide to come to that meeting, whether you decide to come to Australia or not, hear the main message here. Jesus wants us to go to all peoples, to cross whatever cultural barriers are around you, to take the good news of his love to every person on this planet. And that may mean a Chinese student in Melbourne, Australia, or a Muslim from Saudi Arabia in Perth, Australia. It might also mean the mechanic who does your car, or the Muslim on this campus here in Pomona. Cross those cultural barriers. Jesus goes before you, with you, empowers you to cross those barriers and take his love to the people that he died for. Let me pray. God, thank you so much for your amazing love for us and for every person on this planet. Thank you for inviting us on this adventure of taking your gospel to all peoples, making disciples of all nations. And we pray that you would give us the courage, the determination to go to people, whoever they are, whatever the cultural barriers are, to connect with them, to love them and serve them, to show them your love and to talk to them about the gospel. In your name I pray, amen. Now we've got a 2-minute video about Australia to see. If you need to get going to your lectures, that's fine, your classes. Feel free to leave, but we're going to put this video on just to finish with, okay? Bless you all.
Hey, my name's Chris.
I'm Courtney.
I'm Yana.
And welcome to Australia! Brisbane is a city of over 2 million people. We're located on the eastern side of Australia, and we enjoy a subtropical climate.
We really love our sport. Some of the main ones include cricket, Aussie rules football, and rugby. Some of Australia's favourite activities include going to the beach, drinking, and enjoying a barbecue. In fact, we like our barbecues so much that most of our parks have free barbecues to use.
There are over 125,000 university students in our city, which are at 3 major universities. We go to Griffith University, which has 5 campuses and over 35,000 students.
Unlike the United States, Australia hasn't had a very strong impact of Christianity, and although 8 to 10% of people say that they attend church regularly, barely any youth are involved. In fact, if you were to walk up to a random student on campus and ask them what Christianity was all about, you'd be lucky to find even 1 out of 10 people who could tell you.
We'll tell you straight that Aussies are a tough people to reach. Faith in God seem very irrelevant to most of my peers because they don't understand any of it. They want to know they have a purpose and that there is a God who loves them, but there is no one there to tell them.
While atheism has some strong influences on Aussies, many still hold to a type of New Age or Buddhist spirituality with a hint of reincarnation or karma. Confusing? I know.
We really need people who have a heart for God to come here and help us reach our campus. If we do reach our campus, it won't just impact Australia, it'll impact the world. Many universities in Australia have between 25 and 35% international students, many from some of the most unreached countries in the world.
God continues to break into people's lives at Griffith as we see more people come to faith and learn to walk with Him for a lifetime. But we desire Him to do so much more, and to do that we need more people to come and help out on summer project or stint.
We're lucky to come and help us reach our campus, which will impact our country.
What do you reckon?
Wanna have a go?